Hi guys, here's my older adult video presentation and PowerPoint. I chose to do Erickson's stage of psychosocial development, his last stage, integrity versus despair. There's 8 stages that Erickson proposes. It's trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus identity confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and finally integrity versus despair, which is what I chose to do. So Erickson's theory places a greater emphasis on social influences on development than other theories. So for example, Piaget and Freud's theories both stop in adolescence. So Erickson proposes that a person progresses through these 8 stages of psychosocial development and expands through their whole lifetime. So I chose to interview my 77-year-old grandmother. My grandfather needed to be a part of the presentation, a part of the interview as well, since my grandmother was unable to recall a bunch of events and information and data from her own life. They've been married since she was in her just turned 20, I believe. They've been together for over 50 years, and their lives are completely intertwined with one another. So by the end of my interview, it was interesting, but it was pretty unclear if my grandmother actually couldn't remember these events, maybe because of old age, or if it was because she had chosen to block out these things, block out her memories, because she was really unwilling to look introspectively into her feelings or thoughts on her own life and her accomplishments or disappointments. And as we go through this presentation, we'll definitely see that. So Erickson proposes that people in their older age reflect on their lives and assess their successes. So people who are satisfied with what they've accomplished in their life, they have a greater sense of peace and contentment. And those that are not satisfied have a sense of despair and mourn lost opportunities. So my grandfather, my grandma's husband, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. His father had passed away from being the same diagnosis. During this old age stage of their lives, he's also been diagnosed with skin cancer and experienced a heart attack. And his mother had passed away from that as well. So, he's experiencing in this stage of her life, old age, her husband has experienced 2 of the things that his parents have passed away from, a heart attack and prostate cancer. So when I asked her, if she was scared of, when the diagnoses came out, when both of these things had happened, and she said, no, what could I do about it? She just said it so matter-of-factly. It wasn't until her husband, reminded her of what she was actually feeling, because he had remembered what it was like when she had heard the diagnosis. And he was like, remember, and he started telling a story of how their daughter, Dawn, came over, and my grandma apparently had opened the door and started crying immediately when she told Dawn about the cancer diagnosis. And after her husband had reminded her, she was like, oh yeah, I do remember. That was a really scary time. And this was interesting because this is actually the first time in the 2-hour-long interview that I was doing with her that she actually expressed worry, concern, or any kind of emotion besides just stating the facts. So it was pretty interesting. So during this stage, the old age stage of her life, the challenges have been the failing health of her husband, and then also, I interviewed her on her early life as well. Her brother was cognitively impaired. Her mother was mentally ill and physically ill. She was diagnosed with porphyria, which causes confusion and hallucinations. And her aunt was also diagnosed with schizophrenia. So because of, these people were all living in the household with her, from all these people who were just incapable of taking care of one another because of their illnesses, all the responsibilities fell on my grandmother. She was the only other female in the home. Her father was an immigrant from Hungary, and that's what their expectations was that the women were to take care of the children in the household. So, she grew up, her whole childhood was taking care of her brother, taking care of her mom, taking care of the house, to marrying her husband, which led to taking care of their 4 children, the house. one of her children moved back in with her and their my aunt's 2 children. So then my grandma was left taking care of her grandchildren. And now in this stage of her life, she's taking care of her husband who keeps getting diagnosed with things. So those will be her challenges in this stage of her life, is just continuing to take care of other people. When I asked her about her accomplishments in this stage of life, she automatically right off the bat said nothing. I gave her a couple prompts into what she could possibly feel accomplished about. And then she was able to say that she feels accomplished, that she was able to provide and be active in her children and her grandchildren's lives. And she said that she was happy with how her life turned out. So Erickson argues that we move through each stage in a consistent manner and resolve crises unique to each stage. So developmental tasks is defined as a healthy or normal activities that help promote growth. Crises is defined as psychological efforts to adjust the demands of the social environment. And the goal at each stage is to resolve crises by developing positive qualities that allow for growth and support exploration of yourself and your environment. So if tasks and crises are successfully attended to at each stage, the person will gain and process new information that helps them maintain control over their emotional states and their environment. So in stage 8, in integrity versus despair in old age, Erickson, his theory suggests that people will reflect on their lives, take inventory of their successes, and if they're satisfied with their accomplishments, then they have a sense of contentment and peace, and those who are not satisfied have a sense of despair and mourn their lost opportunities. My grandmother was really unable to reflect on her successes or her failures, just due to taking care of other people since childhood. She hasn't developed the skills to reflect on her own life, or think or reflect on what she wished she would have ddone, or what she wishes she would have accomplished. She was just unable to do so. So she was just, she said that she was happy with her accomplishments, which was raising her kids and helping with her, being a part of her grandchildren's lives. She was told by her father that the expectations of her were to take care of the house, to cook and clean, and help raise her siblings. And she was told by her husband that a woman's expectations were she was not allowed to work, and it was to raise the kids and take care of the house. My grandpa said it himself. He was like, she wasn't allowed to work. That was his rule. She was not allowed to work. She had to take care of the kids growing up. And when I asked my grandma if she knew that this was the rule going into their marriage, she said no. But it makes sense that she didn't necessarily have a problem with it, because it's all she knew from her own father's expectations. So like I said, she's a first-generation immigrant. Her father was born and raised in Hungary and moved here in his 20s. He was a very strict and mean and distant father figure. Her mom was diagnosed with porphyria, like we had mentioned, which causes hallucinations and paranoia. She was also a mean and cold, distant parental figure. Her aunt lived with her for a time that was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And her father's beliefs and expectations of a girl was to take care of the children, take care of the house. And, her father didn't let her drive. She didn't learn how to drive until she married my grandpa. She didn't attend college, even though all of her friends did. And she was raised in a lower middle class and married into lower middle class. So, her father's only expectations of her were to take care of the house and help out with her siblings and to get married, and so she got married and married to someone who had very similar expectations, was that she was to take care of the household and take care of the kids. So, these were the only things that she was allowed to do, that she was expected to do. So it makes sense why she feels accomplished in her life, because those were her only expectations that were placed on her, that she placed on herself. So I think that's why she's come to, I would say that she's in crisis resolution, that she is satisfied with how her life turned out, because there was no other chance for anything else. And this is all that she knew, and this is all that was allowed of her. So my grandma definitely faced oppression because of her gender and the time period that she was brought up, and the education that she was allowed to have, being a first-generation immigrant, and her lower middle-class social status. Her mother's illness made her incapable of taking care of her cognitively impaired son and or the household. So those duties and responsibilities fell on my grandma, and she was the only other female in the house, so that's what was expected of her and her gender at the time. She grew up in the 1940s and 50s, and when society expected a girl to get married and take care of kids and take care of the home, they were expected to get married in their late teens and 20s and to have children like right after that. My grandpa said it himself. He said multiple times throughout this interview that this is what was expected. When I was asking my grandma other questions about her life and why she didn't choose to do anything else, or if she was interested in doing anything else besides just getting married, he said it multiple times. This is what was expected during their generation. This is just what was expected of everybody. You go to school, you graduate high school, you get married, you have kids, and that's your life from there on out. So my grandpa definitely confirmed that that's all there really was. There really wasn't much else that was expected of her. So in contrast to Erikson's theory is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. His theory describes how people develop their capability to learn and think and process information from birth to teenage years. He suggests that by 16 or 17 years old, a person should possess the skills necessary to operate in the adult world. He suggests 3 different stages of development that clearly ends at 16 years old. So during my grandmother's concrete operational stage is when she began taking care of her impaired brother and becoming aware of her mother's illness and inability to care for him and care for the rest of the household. So she was also beginning to understand her father's expectations of her being a girl. My grandmother experienced assimilation, which means that she's bringing new information about something. So we can say that her husband, my grandfather's expectations of a woman to take care of the house and children and not to work fit into her already existing schema. The expectations placed on her in childhood and her teenage years by her father to take care of her siblings and take care of the household. So it all kind of fit together, and it made sense to her because this is what she had experienced by her father, So her schema, which is an internal idea that we hold about the world and our efforts to store information to make sense of what happens around us, this makes sense to her that her husband is expecting her not to work and her to just take care of the kids. That's why she didn't really fight him on it, because this is all she really knew. So Piaget's theory definitely has its limitations. I mean, obviously, his theory stops in adolescence versus other theories that propose that we continue developing and growing and changing throughout our lifetime. Erikson's theory clearly states that. His theory also doesn't pay enough attention to socio-cultural factors that affect cognitive development. He doesn't offer much explanation for how personality, social interaction, and culture promote or take away from development. And I think that is huge in my grandmother's case. His theory doesn't take into consideration how social interaction, her parents' cold and distant parenting styles really has played a factor into who she has become and who she is as a person. She learned early on that you don't venture outside of what was expected of you and what was demanded of her. She doesn't question it, because she would say that, if you talked back or you questioned anything, that you were hit automatically. It was physical discipline. Like, children were supposed to be seen, not heard. That's what they kept saying repeatedly. So that was the expectations of her, and she learned it, and she, accepted it. She really had to. She had no other choice. So his theory doesn't take into consideration 2 factors that play a factor in my grandmother's functioning and ability to assess her life or her life experiences. It's that a child who is emotionally stunted in growth due to lack of nurturing from caregivers, or he also doesn't address how a child who hasn't mastered these skills from previous stages due to lack of freedom to explore her own interests and needs and wants. She didn't have this opportunity to see what else she was interested in. She was told what was expected of her and demanded of her. So his theory, Piaget's theory, definitely has its limitations, and we could see how it plays into my grandmother's life. That is my presentation on my older adult interview. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you.